Welcome back to our next indie horror game, Whispers in the Night. Take some time off work and come relax with me. You're stressed out, and if I know anything, a little time away in the mountains will help. Siri Carter could hear her grandmother's weathered voice echo in her head as she drove up winding roads, headed for her grandma's little cabin. She never quite understood why someone would choose to live out here in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia, surrounded by trees and the wild. But her grandma had always been a bit eccentric. She'd tell her grandchildren scary stories of monsters in the forest and the crazed people who worshipped them. Truth was, Siri had always been fascinated by them, but she supposed they were meant to scare her into behaving, and that she did. That clever old woman was right, though. Siri had been working on herself to the bone for the last year, chasing promotion after promotion and trying to make ends meet. She needed a break. She deserved it. So did her car. The engine light blinked on an hour into her drive, and with 5 more to go, she'd ignored it and hoped it would go away like last time. Now that she was 12 miles away from her destination, it didn't. She stared in disbelief as her little car's engine sputtered and slowed. What? No, not now. Siri hung her head, trying to think of what to do next. So we can call a tow truck, or she can get out of the car and try to find a YouTube video on how to fix it. We're going to call the tow truck because I don't even want to start in on the absolute litany of reasons why standing out in the middle of the wilderness in God's nowhere, West Virginia, in the Appalachian Mountains by yourself, trying to find a YouTube video on how to fix your busted ass car is an absolutely moronic idea. So we're going to go with the we're going to call the tow truck. Siri pulls out her phone and types in the number for AAA, but when she hits call, nothing happens. No dial tone, no nothing. You're kidding me. No signal, of course, she said as she threw up her hands in disbelief. I guess I'll just do it myself. As Siri got out of her car, immediate regret settled on her skin. It wasn't cold on the mountain, that was for sure. Summer's blistering heat sinking through the canopy above, making the air hot and sticky. She popped the hood of her car, hoping it would be something minor. Instead, smoke plumed from the engine, taking what little hope she had left for this trip. No YouTube video would have helped this one. I am in way over my head here, she said with a defeated sigh. It was clear she only had 2 options now. Stay in the car and wait for someone to pass, or go off on foot looking for the nearest house. We'll stay in the car for now. I don't want to go tromping around in the Appalachian Mountains alone. As the sun quickly gave way to night, the dark brought with it a freezing cold. Siri dozed off in the back seat of her car, curled under a thin blanket. Something kept her from sleep as she tossed and turned, almost like a voice on the wind. Or maybe it was just the uncomfortable seats. Eventually, she stopped trying to rest and sat up. Grabbing her phone to pass the time, Siri noticed it was midnight. Her grandma had always warned her of being out in the woods once the clock struck 12, using some darker version of an old Cinderella tale. Siri sighed as the wind grew louder, that phantom voice becoming more prominent. It almost sounded like her name, but that couldn't be. She was sleep-deprived and stressed out, nothing more. The whisper grew ever closer, turning into the faint voice of her grandma, weathered and wise. Siri. What if it is Grandma? I didn't get to call her earlier. She's probably worried sick, Siri thought to herself. Yeah, we're not getting out of this car. Absolutely not. Stay in the car and ignore it. Siri sat for a few moments longer, trying to ignore that whisper in the night, but her curiosity was ever her own enemy. Still bundled in her thin blanket, Siri climbed out of her car, nothing but her phone and its little flashlight. The voice beckoned her from deep in the woods. Siri pushed through the brush and thistles, little thorns catching against her skin and drawing little beads of red, until she came across a worn pathway. A sign sat a few feet ahead, and as she drew closer, crude letters were carved into its rotting wood. Stray from the path, this night your last. She watches. The rest of it nothing but an eroded, illegible scratch. Siri heard the voice again, this time sounding more like her grandma. Only it called her westward. The path headed north. Siri. So we can stay on the trail or follow the voice and almost certainly die. We're gonna stay on the. This sign wasn't put here for shits and giggles. Sorry, voice in the woods, but I'm gonna have to pass, Siri thought to herself as she started walking up the path. The voice grew louder, still, but it changed. Her grandma's voice became a desperate cry as branches snapped and the wind blew harder. Damn it, what if it really is her? She could be hurt, Siri said as she stopped walking. Siri, please. The wind pushed against her, seeming to plead her to follow the voice. Nope, we're gonna continue. Siri! The voice was yelling at her now as she trudged along the path, through narrow trees and overgrown shrubs. Siri held her hands over her ears as she ignored the voice as best she could. After 15 minutes of walking, not that Siri could tell how long it had been, all she knew was that she was cold. Her nose was frozen and didn't want to be walking anymore. The path ended just outside of a clearing. A little cabin sitting in the middle of it. Her grandma stood on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders as she called out. Siri, where are you? Those damn sycophants kidnapped her. Good Lord, please let her be safe. Lily Carter looked worried sick as she called out for her granddaughter again. Siri! Siri stumbled into the clearing, her toes numb as she hurried to her grandma, pulling her into a jerky hug. Goodness, girl, you damn near gave me a heart attack. The neighbor called, said he'd passed your car on the road a ways down, but you were nowhere to be seen. I've been calling your name for the better part of an hour. Her grandma's voice was hoarse from yelling for so long. So it was you I heard calling my name. I thought I was going crazy there for a second. That weird sign down the path didn't help any. Grandma Lily's face went pale as she ushered her granddaughter inside. Yeah, some of those real religious folk in the mountains put that up. Think they worship some god of the forest. More like a witch devil. She walked Siri into the spare bedroom and sat her down on the bed. It ain't safe to be out in these woods at night, I taught you that. You do well to remember it the next time you visit. Now let's get you some warm clothes and something to eat. Siri didn't get a chance to ask more before her grandma left the room in a hurry. There was something she wasn't saying, but Siri was too tired to push her. After changing, putting warm food in her hungry belly, Siri sat on her bed and thought about the night's events. A feeling kept pulling her sleepy gaze to the window, but as she stood before it, there was nothing she could see beyond that thick brush she'd made her way through. So, close the curtains and go to sleep. And though Siri slept peacefully as the night wore on, Her grandma Lily sat in the little rocking chair on the porch that overlooked the edge of the forest, a shotgun in her hands as she rocked back and forth and hummed to herself. Her gaze was glued to a shadow just beyond the trees, darker than all the rest. There in the darkness, a hulking creature crouched, meeting Lily's stare with the same heated fervor. Angled bones held up an antlered skull, broken and bleeding gray skin bunched around exposed bone. It huffed, white puffs disappearing into the air as it backed away, looking for another poor soul venturing in the night. The end? Or is it? That is written absolutely fantastically, and there are obviously multiple outcomes, some of which almost certainly end in death. I'm sure if we had followed the voice off the path, we would have been promptly slaughtered by whatever that is. But yeah, you know what? Hell of it. Let's do that just for the hell of it and see what happens. So, how do we get back to that point? Nearest house on foot. Okay, we'll go this way. As the sun quickly gave way to night, the dark brought with it a freezing cold. Siri had been walking for 2 hours, nothing but trees and rocks and more trees with every turn of the road. She didn't think to grab the blanket out of her car before she left. The only thing in her hands was her phone's sorry excuse for a flashlight. I should have just stayed in the car. Way to go, me. Good choices, she said as she stumbled up a small hill. At the top, just as she was about to turn back towards her car, she could see a faint house lights through the sway of the trees. I knew this was a good plan. I never doubted you, past me, Siri said as she ran, more like hobbled, toward the house. Relief washed over her as the house came more into view. The dark made it hard to see, but Siri could tell it was a quaint little home that had definitely seen its better days at the end of a long driveway. Still, though, if it got her out of the cold, Siri didn't mind what it looked like. The porch creaked underneath her weight as she reached up to knock on the door, but she paused. A sense of unease prickled her skin. Or maybe that was just the cold and she was about to keel over. Siri shook her head and let her knuckles fall on the door anyway. An old woman opened the door, a smile on her wrinkled face. She'd worn a black dress that hung off her small frame, making her seem even smaller, brittle even. Wispy black hair stuck out of her head in odd clumps. Oh my goodness, Siri, what brings you all the way out here in the dark? Siri hesitated, something in her mind telling her that she should be wary. My car broke down a few miles down from here. I've been walking for the last couple hours trying to find someone to help. The sun set faster than I thought it would, otherwise I'd have stayed in the car. Siri told the old woman, teeth chittering and rubbing her hands along her arms to stave off the cold. Shaky hands ushered her through the door, the smell of mildew and rot flooding her nose. You're lucky to be alive, honey. It's dangerous in the dark. There's things in these woods that would take quite a liking to a pretty girl like yourself, the old woman said as she sat Siri at her kitchen table. I'm Mary. My husband Henry is off somewhere doing God knows what. Mary looked frail as she shuffled around the corner, returning with a blanket for Siri to cover up with. Do you think I could call my grandmother? She lives not too far from here. She's probably worried sick. Mary tilted her head for a moment, a look of recognition mixed with annoyance crossing her face. Of course, honey. We don't have many neighbors. I assume your grandma is Lily Carter. I love that woman to death. Go ahead and give her a call. Tell her I say hi and that she needs to come over for dinner one of these nights. Siri thought she saw Mary grind her jaw as she motioned toward the old phone that hung on the wall, but brushed it off. Maybe there was some feud between the two. Siri didn't even want to begin to know. It was none of her business. She stood from the little table inside Mary's home and punched in her grandma's number into the phone. Hello? A smile spread across Siri's lips as her grandmother's weathered voice came through the phone. Hey, it's Siri. My car broke down on the way to your house. Siri, I've been worried sick. Why didn't you call me earlier? Her grandma's usually cool tone became a shriek. I didn't have a signal, so I walked until I found someone's house. I'm at Mary's now. She said you should stop by for dinner soon. That wicked woman! I'm on my way right now. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Siri pulled the phone away from her ear as the call cut short, sharp tones blasting into the silence. What the hell? Siri thought to herself, putting the phone back on the wall. Her grandma had never acted that way before, at least not that she'd seen. Everything all right, dear? Mary said, causing Siri to jump in her own skin. Yeah, my grandma is on her way. She nodded to the old woman. I think your phone line just went down. Mary gave her a tight smile. Oh, that happens sometimes. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. It's just a perk of living in the mountains. Would you like something to eat while you wait? That unease grew tenfold as Siri looked at Mary, the old woman's gaze burning lines into her skin. No, thank you. Mary stayed still for a moment before swiftly turning and disappearing down the darkened hallway. Siri looked around for the first time since she stepped foot in the place. Water-stained walls and peeling paper. The ceiling had holes along the edges as if something had chewed its way in. The floor was uneven. It was a wonder she hadn't tripped coming in. In the distance, she heard a car echo through the trees. Grandma. Siri wasn't sure where Mary had gone. She hadn't returned after hobbling down that hallway, but there were sounds. Odd sounds of wet popping and whispered cries. Siri stared down that hallway, curious. The car was getting closer, the sounds getting louder. Well, our only choice is to head toward the weird noises. Siri took a small step towards the dark, and then another. The cries became deeper, almost guttural. Mary, are you back there? She called out, fear stealing up her spine as she took another step closer. A black door sat at the end of the hallway, an odd carving in its darkened wood. Siri inched closer, the floor creaking underneath her as she did. The sound stopped. Silence rang in her ears as Siri reached a shaking hand toward the door. As Siri's hand touched the little knob, the smell of death reached her nose. Gagging at the smell, she staggered back. The front door slammed open, Siri's grandma standing in the frame. She looked like she'd come straight out of a book with her long graying braid, a shotgun in her hands. Siri, let's go, she called back, double barrel aimed down the hallway. Siri ran to her grandma and out of the house as that little black door came crashing down, a roar bellowing into her bones. Lily Carter slowly backed out of the house, never turning away from that awful sound, her gun trained on whatever crawled closer. It was big. Siri could tell that much. The house groaned underneath its weight as it came into her view. A tall thing with gnarled limbs and exposed ribs, a red dripping skull sitting upon bleeding dull flesh and half-broken antlers, stalked through the small living room of Mary's crumbling home. Get in the driver's seat, Siri, her grandma said, eyes never leaving the monster. As Siri clambered into the running truck, she watched as the creature angled out of the front door, pointed joints popping as it squeezed its massive body through. And then it spoke. Should have told Lily. Told me. The monster spoke in a dissonant voice, like there were so many speaking it hurt to listen. She wandered, didn't stay on the path. Lily was at the passenger door now, her gun still on the thing before she spoke. Go to hell, witch. Siri switched gears as her grandmother climbed into the seat beside her, and she drove as fast as she could. The monster roared again, charging right into a buckshot. It yelped as they sped away to the little cabin up the hill. What the hell was that? Sari stared at her grandma as the safety clicked on the shotgun. That was Mary, Lily said as she looked at her granddaughter. I told you all about her when you were younger, did I not? Sari stared with wide eyes, mouth agape. What? How was I supposed to know those stories were real? Her grandma chuckled as the pair walked into her little cabin. It was warm and inviting, so unlike Mary's little death trap. Every story has some truth in it, girl. Some more than others. Come on, let's get you to bed. You'll feel better in the morning. Sari couldn't sleep that night. Didn't think she'd ever sleep again. She'd taken a shower, trying to scrub that burning stare from her skin, but nothing worked. It remained, drawing paths along her red, raw skin. Her grandma told her they'd tow her car to the cabin in the morning so she could head back home if she wished. Sari just nodded, numb. So much for a relaxing time in the mountains, she said, finally drifting off to sleep. A dull roar echoing in the distance. Her name whispered on the wind. So, that wasn't the be a dumbass and follow the voice into the Appalachian Woods trail here. Let's see if we can't get back to that one and see what happens with that. And we end up getting out of the car anyway. Here we go. Get out of the car and investigate. Follow the voice. There it is. Okay. Sari gave in, unable to let her curiosity loose. Her grandma's voice like a vice. Every step she took chipped away at that pit in her stomach. Maybe she was a fool for leaving the path, but Sari didn't care. The fear in her belly wasn't even for herself. As she walked deeper into the woods, the wolf voice still luring, silence became a living thing. The birds and the bugs no longer sang in the night. The wind no longer howled. The only thing to be heard were the creaking of the trees and her own breathing. A symbol was carved on one of the wide trunks, then another and another, until all of them did. As Sari looked up, she noticed something dangling from the branches above. A doll made from twigs and leaves. A cord wrapped around its throat, and across from it a jumbled mess of broken sticks and dead plants. Small makeshift antlers poking out of it like knives. The smell of decay and rot struck her nose, and still she delved deeper into the dark until a grand table came into view. It was beautiful, with small hand-carved pictures on its sides. And should Sari have seen it on any other day, perhaps then she'd have seen the warning for what it was. A heaping mess of rotten food and broken plates. Blood-smeared cups and a glittering knife sat before her. Something is wrong, Sari thought to herself. It had been a while since she last heard the voice call her name. She didn't realize it until it sounded just behind her. Sari. She didn't dare turn around as the back of her neck prickled, freezing her where she stood. Something snapped behind her, but Sari stared at the table before her, hand inching toward the knife. Hot breath blew on her neck, her body trembling now as she choked back a sob. Sari, didn't listen. Her grandmother's voice spoke the broken words, something dark twisting within it, something evil. It sniffed her as it said, I watch, always watching, didn't follow, Sari, didn't listen, must take, must make pay. The creature behind Sari placed a sharp claw on her shoulder, turning her toward it before lifting her up in the air, sharp nails digging into her flesh. Gnarled limbs and exposed ribs, a red dripping skull sitting upon bleeding dull flesh, gleaming teeth and half-broken antlers stood before her. She screamed then, loud and ear-splitting in the silent dark, but the creature didn't falter, simply stared at her with something akin to interest. As swiftly as it picked her up, she fell to the ground as the thing bellowed, "Run!" So, if we stay on the ground, we're gonna die, for sure. But let's do that and see what happens. Siri didn't move from the forest floor, staring up in horror as the creature ripped a chunk of flesh from its body, letting out a guttural and unholy roar. "Grandma, forgive me." The beast's claws whipped through the air, catching her stomach. The smell of her own blood filled Siri's nose as she cried out in pain. She tried to scoot away then, but too much blood poured out of her belly, tendrils of something within sloshing against her hand. The creature's teeth were the last thing she saw. So let's back up once and see what happens if we run away from it. Siri scrambled from the floor and ran as fast as she could. It seemed like the creature was giving her a head start, which only made her terror worse. A roar sounded from behind her, and as she looked back to see where the thing was, she tripped. Something soft and gooey catching her foot. Siri gave a small scream as she could see the outline of a body, daisy-printed fabric covered in old blood. Its last meal. Siri cried as she hurried to her feet again and ran through the woods, the creature close behind. It was toying with her, playing like a cat does with a mouse. Lights flickered on in the distance, a small spark of hope building in Siri's chest. Okay, so we can keep running or we can knock on the door. Let's keep running for it. Siri ran past the house. She wasn't sure if she could trust them or not. What would have happened if they were those cult folk her grandma would tell her stories about? If the thing behind her was real, then so were they. Eventually, though, Siri stopped hearing the creature's pounding steps behind her, so she slowed, trying to catch her breath. She'd been running for a while, completely lost now. She walked slowly through the trees, looking at the ground to make sure she didn't trip on any more carcasses. She passed a tree with a carved symbol in its wide face, then another and another. Small figures hung from the branches above her, but she kept her head down, trying not to fall from shaky legs. A branch snapped behind her, that heavy breath ringing in her ears. She looked up then, that messy table before her once more, the knife taunting her. The creature had chased her back to where she started. If she could just get to the knife. The creature spoke as she ran towards the blade, its voice a dissonant amalgamation of tones. It didn't move, simply observed. "You are afraid, Siri. I taste it." Siri turned slow, knife held up to the monster that spoke. Her hair was a tangled mess, dirt smeared her face. She looked as much of a wild thing as the creature before her. "Leave me alone. Just let me go." Odd, Siri is. Ran, but doesn't. Fears, but isn't. Brave fool for leaving path. Different. Siri braced for the creature to pounce, to run her through with one of its taloned hands, but it didn't. It just watched. "Show me the way home, or so help me God," she spat. The creature cocked its head for a moment. Longer, before turning its massive skull back towards the worn path. "She watches until proven. The weak and the worthy shall be judged. There is no God, only me." The creature howled before stomping in the opposite direction, blending in with the dark. "Stray from the path this night your last. She watches until proven. The weak and the worthy shall be judged." The last bit of that rotting sign she read. Siri shook her head in disbelief and ran up the path. It stopped just before her clearing, her grandma's little cabin just beyond. She'd made it. She was safe. So if we back up and knock on the door for that cabin, because I think this is the only path we haven't done so far. Siri ran toward the little house, its lights fueling the well of hope in her chest. "Help me, please!" She knocked and pleaded until the door cracked open. An elderly woman peeked her face through the small opening before swinging the door wide. She was clad in a black dress that looked far too big for her frail frame. Her face wrinkled and weathered as she smiled at Siri. "Oh, goodness, dear, you look like you've been chased through the woods. Are you okay?" The unease coiled in Siri's belly again. "I need help. Please." "Come in, dear. You can use our phone while I get you some new clothes. You've got to be freezing." The old woman ushered her into the house. It was warm and inviting, the little kitchen smelling like fresh pie. "Here, wear these." The old woman handed her a stack of clothes. "I'm Mary. This is my husband, Henry." "Thank you," Siri said, gingerly taking the clothes before adding, "Where's your phone? I need to call my grandma. She's probably worried sick." The couple both motioned to the ancient box on the wall. "Thank God I know how to use one of those," Siri thought to herself as she smiled to the couple. Punching in her grandma's number, she let relief wash over her when she heard that familiar voice. "Hello? Mary, why are you calling so late?" The line went dead. "Hello? Grandma? Are you there?" Siri put the phone back on the wall. Mary, is it alright if I stay here tonight? I couldn't get through to my grandma, Lily." Mary smiled. "Of course, dear. There's a spare bedroom at the end of the hallway." Siri nodded and hobbled down the darkened hallway toward the black door at the end. Laying on the bed, new clothes on her frozen skin, Siri just stared at the ceiling. That pit in her stomach wouldn't seem to go away. Eventually, Siri drifted off to sleep, dreams of monsters chasing and blood spilling plaguing her mind. A cold breeze drew bumps along her skin, waking her from her terrible slumber. The bed she laid on last night had been comfortable, plush. Now it felt cold and hard as the ground, and her wrists ached. Siri opened her eyes to the dark sky above her, small figures swaying in a silent wind. She tried to stand up and run, but her hands were tied around the base of a tree. She was back where she started. Siri looked around, panicked eyes darting back and forth until she spied Mary at that familiar table. "She's awake," Henry called as he walked into Siri's view. He had a strange face, scarred and mottled, as he stared at her with wicked eyes. The beast'll like this one, that's for sure. Mary gave a toothy smile as she passed behind a wide trunk and said something Siri couldn't make out. Her ears were pounding as she listened to wet pops and soft cries, to skin ripping. A creature stepped out from behind the trunk, Mary nowhere in sight. "Isn't she beautiful, my Mary?" Henry spoke softly as he moved out of his wife's way. Siri didn't get a chance to scream before sharp teeth descended, silencing her. "Delicious," the creature said, but in a soft voice came out of its dripping jaw. Not the dissonant Minnie, not Mary's, but something young and delicate. Siri's voice. That was fantastic. I think we explored every path there. I don't think I missed any. But that is written very, very well. And as both someone who has, relatives from that region and is also a giant, folklore nerd, I'm very, very familiar with the creepy things supposedly wandering around in the Appalachian Mountains. So that's, yeah, I like that. I like that story a lot. That's really good. Very, very well written. Very good. So that was Whispers in the Night. Thank you for listening to that. Details are in the description. Thank you for watching, as always. Like if you like that, dislike it if not, and I'll see you in the next one.